Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced, subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, free speech TV, and podcast platforms. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world is overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series, exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers in the movements for social justice, and we'll dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. My guest this week is Hannah Appel. She's one of the co-founders of the Debt Collective and teaches economic anthropology at UCLA and is a proud mother of 2 children. Welcome to the program, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Sonali. It's great to be here.
And did I say your last name correct? Is it Appel or Appel?
You know, as you might expect, I've been called Hannah Appel all my life. It is Appel, but I answer happily to Hannah Appel, but it's Appel.
Thank you so much for being with us. Let's talk about Debt Collective and how you summarize the work that your organization has done. I been familiar with the organization for a long time, and in my mind, it's most commonly been associated with tackling student debt, which I suspect is how it started, but now it seems as though you've really expanded your vision, your jurisdiction, if you will, to many different kinds of debt. So tell us about the broad strokes of Debt Collective.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Debt Collective is the nation's first debtors union, and we aim to organize debtors to abolish debts and fight for a world in which everything we need to survive and thrive, housing, education, healthcare, is provided to us without going into often disabling, quite literally disabling debt. And we aim to do that through organizing debtors to build debtor power. But you are absolutely right that we're best known for our work in student debt. And you are also right that that's because that's where we've started, right? That's where our movement initially started, first organizing folks who had attended for-profit colleges. And it's important to know that they and very few student debtors are actually in debt to those colleges, right? They're in debt to the federal government. But folks who had been defrauded by for-profit colleges, this is back about a decade ago when we started, those were the first folks we organized with and the first folks with whom we had some major victories. And now, about a decade into this experiment in debtors unions, certainly in our student debt work, we have abolished billions of dollars in student debt. We have taken student debt abolition all the way to the Supreme Court. And I think it was just yesterday, or was it today, that Trump's Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, announced that they were going to stop wage garnishment. So it is the place where we've had the most organizing successes. But you are also right that from the very beginning, the Debt Collective's vision was always about debtors unions. It was not specific to student debt. And now, again, about a decade in, our work spans student debtors, medical debtors, housing debtors, lunch debtors, sadly that is a thing, abortion debtors, really trying to think strategically and creatively about which debtors we can work with in order to build the power to bring the world we need, right? Which again is that healthcare for all, education for all, housing for all.
Right. And just to be clear for those who maybe are coming at this from, I want to say, maybe old-fashioned approach of like, you get into debt, you pay your debt. It seems as though you're not talking about going into debt to buy your second vacation home or going into debt to invest in some surefire corporate investing. The point of the organization is to address the idea that nobody should have to go into debt in order to survive and just live and thrive a normal life and a happy life. Is that fairly accurate?
That's exactly right. The idea that nobody should have to go into debt for the things that they need in life, and the further idea that in fact, because so many of us, essentially all of us, have been forced into debt, whether it was because of our college education or because of an apartment we can't afford or because of healthcare that is underinsured and far too profitable for capital and not about the well-being of people, that paradoxically, all of that debt that we're in, maybe we're in debt to the carceral system, right? That all of that debt we're in is actually a form of latent power to overthrow that very system. But just to get to your point about, is it because of your second vacation home? There's a phrase that we say a lot at the Debt Collective, which is, we are not in debt because we live beyond our means. We are in debt because we are denied the means to live. And so trying to re-educate ourselves as debtors about what would it mean to live in a world where we were not denied the means to live or put into debt for the means to live, right? The means to get an education, the means to access healthcare, the means to have a roof over our head. First, of course, this is so often the project in organizing, opening our imaginations to that, right? Through narrative work, through political education, and then thinking about the strategies and tactics necessary to build the debtor power, in this case, to bring that world into existence.
So going back to what you were saying about what Debt Collective has achieved and has worked on, it sounds as though it's not just about organizing debtors to do policy changes, but actually doing the nuts and bolts of debt elimination, right? Like actually buying up debt for pennies on the dollar from debt consolidators and paying it off. And I'm assuming doing that in a symbolic way, because of course, it's not possible for a single organization to erase all unnecessary debt. So let's talk about the things that you actually do with debtors and for debtors.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say our overall strategy, I think I can articulate in kind of two big buckets, right? One, we are building the collective political consciousness of debtors around why it is we're in debt, right? Precisely because we are denied the means to live, but then also building the material power of debtors. And so if that's the overall strategy, then there are lots of tactics, to your point, right, that we use to get there. So we run debtors assemblies. We have many affinity groups of debtors, whether folks over 50 who hold student debt. There's kind of a profound misconception that student debt is held by young people. I'm 47 years old. My family has about $80,000 in student debt. So we have a 50 over 50 affinity group. We have a debt and disability affinity group. We have a healthcare workers affinity group. We do a lot of political education. We also run a lot of legal mutual aid. So we have a really fantastic project out here in California called the Tenant Power Toolkit, which I'm happy to talk about, that's around housing debt. We run debt strikes. So we're running a debt strike right now around some utility bills of one of the nation's largest corporate landlords. But then you mentioned another tactic that we've used over time, which we've called the rolling jubilee, which is where we buy up debt for pennies on the dollar and abolish it. So we've abolished abortion debt that way. We've abolished some carceral debts that way. We've abolished some ambulance debts that way. But as you say, that particular tactic, it's interesting. It's very mediagenic. It's very spectacular, which is to say it kind of generates a spectacle. We've bought up a bunch of historically Black colleges and universities debts that way. But we always want to come with an organizing strategy on the back end. And that particular tactic, right, the rolling jubilee tactic, and you said this, but it can be deceptive because it can seem like there's some magic trick through which we can buy up and abolish debts. And that's simply not the case. The case is that we have to build power toward systemic change. And we've actually already built quite a bit of that in student debt. So right now, as we continue, of course, to focus on student debt abolition does not make sense if the very system that got you into debt in the first place stays on past the debt abolition, which is to say, wouldn't it be great if we won full student debt abolition, all $1.7 trillion of outstanding student debt was abolished, but if then the so-called public university at which I teach, right, the University of California system or New York or Michigan, right, any of these formerly public systems, if they are still tuition driven, we will have not solved the systemic problem that got folks into debt in the first place. This is also the case with medical debt, right? This is also the case with housing debt. And
right, so you can take care of debt that's already been accrued, but then what about future debtors? It's not as though suddenly their debt is legitimate.
That's exactly right. We have to change the system so that we are not forced into debt for the things that we need in life.
And so it seems as though this debt cancellation, the debt jubilee you were saying, has a specific narrative impact, has a specific goal, I imagine, to show that A, it can be done and it is easy, and B, that it is such a big issue that such action can have impact on people's lives. So it seems as it's almost a challenge to the government to say that, hey, if we can do it, why can't you, kind of thing. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I will say, so we use the rolling jubilee tactic, this tactic of buying up debts on secondary markets, very sparingly. We almost never do it. It is definitely not kind of one of the main things in our toolkit. But certainly it does show, exactly as you say, the flexibility, the pliability of debt, right? Debt, we are told, is something, oh, if you've taken on a debt, you have to pay it. But that is really a phony morality that applies radically unevenly, right? So poor folks, working class folks, even middle class folks definitely feel compelled by that morality. Very wealthy people, very wealthy corporations, right, are always using debt as leverage, are always getting out from under their debts. In fact, our current president, right, is known as the bankruptcy king, right? So large corporations, extraordinarily wealthy individuals have always been able to leverage the power of debt in their favor. And that's because when you hold debt in huge amounts, it actually is a form of power. So kind of 20th century industrialist John Paul Getty famously said, you know, if I owe the bank $100, that's my problem. I'm going to have to pay it. But if I owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. And his point is that if he owes the bank $100 million, he actually has leverage over that bank. Student debtors owe $1.7 trillion. So much of credit card debt in this country is actually medical debt. When you think about the rent that tenants pay to these huge and growing corporate landlords across the country, right? It is trillions of dollars every year. So debtors individually, right? Well, then we owe the bank. But collectively, organized in a union formation, actually have the kind of material power and leverage potentially that wealthy individuals and corporations have. And that is the horizon toward which we're working, building that kind of systemic unionized debtor power.
I mean, that is the logic of a union, right? Collective bargaining power.
Yes.
When many who have less power join together, they can challenge the powerful. So how do you achieve your main goals, which is organizing debtors? We mentioned many different kinds of debt. Is it the same sort of organizing that's applied to medical debtors and student debtors, or do you have different strategies on how you bring people in and help organize them based on what kind of debt or maybe age group they're in or geographic location?
It's such a good question. And as I said, the Debt Collective has been around for 10 years, and we internally still identify very much as an experimental project, right? And the kinds of questions you just asked are questions that we are experimenting with all the time. And part of that is because different kinds of debt essentially have different creditors, right? Which is to say, different entities to which the debt is owed. And so in the case of student debt, 1.7, maybe it's 1.6, I should have checked the statistic, trillion dollars of student debt owed. The one single creditor is the United States federal government, right? And so the strategies that we can use in student debt take advantage of the fact, first, that all of those student debtors, 47 million of us across the country, all of us owe a single creditor. And that creditor is, in theory, democratically accountable. Right? So that's different than if you owe a bank or if you owe a major pharmaceutical company or something like that, right? So that definitely informs our strategies and tactics in student debt. So in student debt, we have for a very long time run debtors' assemblies. We have within student debt certain kinds of affinity groups, including the 50 over 50. We have a group, a disabled debtors caucus, folks who owe student debt in particular. They also work in the medical debt space. As I said, we do a lot of political education. In student debt in particular, no, that's not true. I guess across the debt types, we do a lot of legal mutual aid. We do a lot of other kinds of legal work and legal consulting. So for example, if you go to debtcollective.org, you can see the executive order that we wrote with movement lawyers that President Biden and of course now President Trump could simply sign to abolish all student debt lawfully. So we have all kinds of strategies in student debt, but I would say assisted by the fact that there is a single creditor. When you get into the landscape of medical debt, or when you get into the landscape of housing debt, right, the creditors are much more disaggregated. So when we're talking about medical debt, sometimes obviously we're thinking of the disastrous so-called big beautiful bill, which of course is going to kick 15 million people off of their medical care, but is also going to profoundly worsen medical debt. So a bunch of our members mobilized to DC to protest that. We did some civil disobedience. A bunch of our disabled debtors caucus participated in that event. We have a healthcare workers solidarity collective. So folks who actually are providers of healthcare, but also want to get it out of this debt-ridden system and into a system of Medicare for all. We have worked in specific locations with hospitals, with nurses unions. So again, each debt type requires an analysis of, okay, who are the debtors and who are the creditors? And I'll just give one final example in housing. So during the pandemic, certainly here in California, but across the country, there were a couple years where your inability to pay your rent was decoupled from immediate eviction, right? So there was this understanding that people had lost their jobs overnight or couldn't attend their jobs or had lost family members to COVID or were caring for family members or were deeply vulnerable to the pandemic. And so people were able to not pay rent for a couple months, but then still stay in that apartment. It was a COVID-19 protection. Those protections ended, they sunsetted at the end of COVID, but those debts accrued. And when the protections ended, those people were evicted for the back rent that they owed, even though, of course, there was no way to get those wages back. There was no way to get that salary back. So now we have a situation in which there are billions and billions of dollars owed disproportionately to some of the nation's largest corporate landlords in rent debt, sloshing around across this country. Not only do those folks have an eviction on their record, making it almost impossible to get into housing, but they're also carrying around $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 worth of rent debt. So we have organized a group of those debtors, the EQR9, Equity Residential 9. You can find them on our website or on eqrdtu.org, Equity Residential Debtors and Tenants United. Right? So again, the point is the landscapes of household debt, student debt, medical debt, housing debt are really different. And we have to analyze each landscape, right? And then decide what the most strategic organizing formation is.
I mean, what you're describing sounds like such careful strategizing work, because on the surface it sounds like, debt strike, okay, a bunch of people can just get together and say, we refuse to pay our debt back and we're going to withhold our money till we get a change, etc. But it's not that simple. It requires a lot of groundwork, a lot of legal work, a lot of preparation, a lot of organizing to do it correctly, which I think is really important and impressive for an organization that's only been around for 10 years and also, I think shows the kind of trust, I think, that people who are struggling with debt can put in to your organization, which leads me to the question of how can people who are struggling with various forms of debt that you work on participate, join in, find some relief, feel, like basically if they want to get involved?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the easiest way is to go to our website, debtcollective.org, all one word, and sign up to become a member. So you can sign up for $0 a month dues, which is totally fine. If you have $2 a month, if you have $5 a month, if you have $100 a month, we of course really appreciate that. But by signing up to become a member, you get our regular newsletter, you get access to all of our political education series. Again, student debt, housing debt, abortion debt, political education on debt and imperialism. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we offer. And then you can learn more about all of the different campaigns that we have going on. We're actually about to launch a leadership school for organizers. I mean, there's always so much going on at the Debt Collective. And I do think that by becoming a member and by receiving that weekly. The newsletter is monthly, but then when big things happen, you'll get something in your inbox. And then, of course, following us on social media. And I think, Sonali, you'll probably post those, but we do our best to keep folks updated on what we're doing and ways that they can plug in through social media as well.
I want to ask you about the issue of narrative, and we've been kind of touching on this in our conversation, which is that there is this perhaps very uniquely American approach to debt, which is rooted in this myth of personal responsibility, rooted in this individualist, capitalist notion of each individual for themselves need to do what they need to do to survive. They get into a mess, they fix it, right? So how do you, and in order to address debt as a systemic issue, I imagine a large part of the struggle is changing our culture and our cultural approach to how we think about debt. So what are the sort of narrative strategies that Debt Collective has adopted or developed to change our national dialogue around debt?
100%. So I have so many things that I want to say in response to this wonderful question. The first thing I'll say is, when you look in the newspaper or when you look in the Federal Reserve statistics, or if you're just kind of looking up conventional writing about the kinds of debts that I've been talking about, whether it's student debt, whether it's medical debt, whether it's credit card debt, whether it's utility bill debt, right? Most often, these are talked about as consumer debt. To your point that the kind of accepted narrative is de facto a capitalist narrative. It's about consumption. So it goes back to this idea that, people are only in debt because they're living beyond their means and it's their fault. But if you actually look at the debt statistics, if there are 45 million people in student debt right now who cannot pay, that tells you that those 45 million people did not all individually make a bad decision. Rather, there is a systemic problem. And as is true of all systemic problems, it is not evenly distributed. Across nearly all categories of the debt that I'm talking about, Black women hold that debt disproportionately. So one of the kind of biggest narrative shifts that we use at the Debt Collective is we do not refer to consumer debt, right? People are not in debt because of that flat screen TV. People are not in debt because of that second vacation home, right? They're in debt because they're denied the means to live. And so the shift that we use is from consumer debt to household debt, because people never take on these debts alone, right? We have staff members at the Debt Collective who themselves have, actually one of our core organizers has about $250,000 in student debt. She was the first in her family to go to college. She comes from a poor family. She went to college and then she went to grad school and then she got a PhD, right? And she racked up that much debt. She now has a daughter who is headed into college herself, trying to go to one of these wonderful so-called public schools that we have in this country, but all of which are now tuition funded. That debt is held in the household. It is held intergenerationally, right? Can I pay my grandma's chemotherapy payment and make rent at the same time, or make the mortgage payment at the same time? Can I afford to have both kids go to college and still pay for my health care? Very often, far too often, the answer to that is no. But what you see is these aren't individual consumers making choices. Do they want the blue sneakers or the red sneakers, right? These are households making excruciating decisions about how to keep a roof over their head, how to stay healthy, and how to try to educate their families.
Finally, Hannah, how does your organization, how does Debt Collective's work fit within the broader context of the social justice universe? Who do you see as your natural allies?
That's such a great question. And there are many things I would say to answer it, but let me start here. One of the ways to understand abolition, right, is of course the abolition of police, the abolition of prisons, the abolition of borders, the abolition of patriarchy, right? Well, there's so much, the abolition of imperialism. But there is also abolitionist presence, right? And I'm kind of drawing on Ruth Wilson Gilmore here, very famous, well-known abolitionist organizer and thinker, scholar. Ruthie Gilmore says, abolition is actually about abolishing the conditions under which prisons become the so-called solution to social problems, right? What are the conditions that make prisons seem to be the answer to social problems. The conditions are that people cannot afford adequate housing. People cannot access education if and when they want it. People cannot afford adequate health care. People are not able to live in thriving environments, right? So these structural conditions create and that are also, of course, driven by white supremacy, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anything unwhite racism, as we're seeing so profoundly right now in this country, right? Those are the conditions. So the question is, yes, abolition is about dismantling the carceral state, right? Dismantling police, dismantling prisons, but it is also about building, right, an affirmative vision of abolition, abolitionist presence, building what we call at the Debt Collective reparative public goods, housing for all, healthcare for all, education for all. And so that's where we see debtors as having a unique kind of material leverage or power, right, to say we are not collectively going to pay our medical debts because we need to use our power to build a system in which those are free. So I think the abolition movement is actually an extraordinarily capacious frame, a big frame for thinking about racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, all in one, housing justice, right? All in one frame. So I often use the abolition movement as the broadest frame. And then the question is, within that capacious movement, what power do we have? Where do we have power? And how do we not leave any power on the table? And I think, very clearly we have power at the workplace as we organize in unions. We have power in the home as we organize as tenants unions. And we have power as debtors, right? As we organize into debtors unions to establish the world we want. So yeah, I often use the abolition movement as a big container that contains all of us within it.
Give out a website finally, Hannah, for Debt Collective, and presumably that's the starting place for people to directly get involved.
Absolutely. Please visit us at debtcollective.org. Maybe grab a copy of Can't Pay, Won't Pay and read a little bit for yourself, or check out the film You Are Not Alone. You can find it easily on YouTube. And get in touch with us. We're always accepting new members and eager to bring people into the movement, always.
Thank you again, Hannah. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sonali. I appreciate all the work that you do.
My guest has been Hannah Appel. She is one of the co-founders of the Debt Collective and teaches economic anthropology at UCLA and is a proud mother of 2 children. This is Rising Up for Justice. And I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of this new weekly half-hour series, exclusive to viewers of Free Speech TV and subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. You can find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.